Welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about different types of ecosystems and the different organisms that live there and how all of those things start to play together. So we're going to take all of our information from before and add it to this. And I'm going to jump right in here. We have a picture of a bunny and he's adorable. And I have with him the name organism. I want you to understand that the single individual animal or plant or bacteria, one thing is an organism. But when I take a big group of the same organism, I am talking about a population. So a population is a group of organisms in one single species that live in one area. Remember that a species is an organism or two organisms that can breed together and produce viable offspring, offspring that can then reproduce. So if I have two different species, even though they look alike, they're unable to make any viable children. Here I have my bunny population feeding on, it looks like some kind of fruit. And remember that the population has to be in one single area. So this could be the bunny population of South Carolina, whereas the bunny population of Venezuela is going to look very, very different. When I take the population and add it together with many different populations, I get a community. Looks like some kind of meadow community where I have my rabbit population, my grass population, the earthworm population, bacteria, all of the different organisms that are living in that one place. A big distinction comes in when I talk about the ecosystem. An ecosystem is a combination of not only all the biotic or the living things, but also the abiotic, the non-living factors in one place. So when I talk about an ecosystem, I'm not only talking about this community, but I'm also including rainfall and UV radiation or sunlight, the rock wall behind the rabbits, the actual soil components, that rock. All of the other non-living pieces are included in the ecosystem. If I zoom even further out, I get what's called a biome. A biome is a geographic region that we define with a certain set of characteristics. And on land, those characteristics are typically climate related, so temperature and precipitation or rainfall. The example I have here is the temperate forest. I'll zoom out for you. My temperate forest, we have all over the place here. That's pretty much where we live when you go into any forested area. But there are also temperate forests in Europe, in parts of Asia. They're pretty widespread. Australia also has quite a few. So we also talk about, the desert biome, the tropical rainforest biome. These are big geographic regions that are relatively the same. If I zoom out even more, I get to the biosphere. This is the part of the Earth that can support life. So it includes the lithosphere, or the rock layer of Earth, the top layer, the atmosphere, our air, and our hydrosphere, the water. All of these three things put together make up the biosphere, the living part of the Earth. I would like to point out that biomes are strictly terrestrial. They're only land areas. The same concept applies in water, but in water we talk about aquatic life zones. The biggest distinction here is not so much climate, but salinity. So I have freshwater aquatic life zones and saltwater aquatic life zones. And I've got a picture here of a saltwater aquatic life zone chart. So we have the coastal or intertidal zone, then we have the big distinction here, euphotic zone, then down to the bathyl, the abyssal. In the euphotic zone, I have lots of light, it's fairly warm, I've got lots of productivity going on. The bathyl zone, we've got more pressure, very little light, and then finally the abyssal zone where it's very, very high pressure, it's very cold, and there is no sunlight. We will discuss biomes and aquatic life zones in class at your next class meeting, so we'll go into a lot more depth here. Important terms for this, I want you to remember. First of all, when I look at biomes, it's very easy to assume that biomes are very strict regions. So you see one and then you see another. But when we really look at them and when you're in that environment, we actually come across areas called ecotones. Those are transitional areas between the ecosystem. There's not a fence up between the rainforest and the desert. Instead, there's a broad transitional zone. It's important to know that in these ecotones, there are specific organisms that have evolved to live just there. And that becomes a major impact or a major factor when we look at biodiversity, or the diverse, or the number of organisms that are living in a place. The next up is ecozone. Within a single ecosystem, there are places that are very small but share very similar features. This is our ecozone. So within the tropical rainforest, I have an area called the canopy. That's the upper level where all of the treetops are and our vines are reaching toward. And there are whole small, almost mini ecosystems within the larger tropical rainforest ecosystem. That is our ecozone. When we talk about what kind of animals or plants can live in a particular biome, we need to look at the law of tolerance. The law of tolerance tells us how well organisms can tolerate change within their environment, and that varies from organism to organism and with species to species. Some organisms, if it gets too cold, they're perfectly happy with that. Some of them, if it gets just a couple of degrees warmer or a couple of degrees colder, can start to die off. So the tolerance range of different organisms is very important in determining what kind of biome that they can live in. Next up is the law of minimum. This will be very important when we talk about populations, but I want to go ahead and introduce it now. In any species, organisms are going to grow and live and reproduce until they absolutely can't anymore. They're going to use all the resources that they can until all of their resources are gone. And this is really important for human populations, but we also see it in the natural world. Again, very big when we talk about population control. The law of minimum is also where we get limiting factors. Remember, limiting factors are those things that limit how many of a population can be in one place at one time. So when we talk about what kind of limiting factors there are, we're really talking about which resources a species or a population has used up the fastest. And finally on here, we have the edge effect. Remember, from ecotone at the top of our list, there are transitional areas. Because of these, we actually see greater biodiversity at the very edge of a biome rather than at its center. In the very center of a desert, there is a lot less biodiversity than around the edges of a desert. And that's because of all of these organisms that live in the ecotone, in those transitions. The edge effect will become really important when we talk about habitat fragmentation and habitat loss. If there are organisms that only live in those transitions, or that only live on the outer fringes of a habitat, those are also the areas of a habitat that are lost first when places are destroyed. So those are the species that are really in danger of extinction. Speaking of habitat, very quickly, I want to talk about the habitat versus the niche or niche. A habitat is mostly the physical environment that an organism is living in. It refers to the temperature, the rainfall, so the climate. It talks about the type of soil composition. It talks about other species that are in the area. So it's the ecosystem itself. Where does it live? The niche refers to the role that the organism plays in that environment. So a shrimp lives in a saltwater environment, and that's its habitat. But the niche it plays is very important. A shrimp is going to feed on phytoplankton and zooplankton. It's also a filter feeder, so it can eat small, it'll filter things out through the water. And its role is very, very important. And the niche itself is much more specialized than a habitat. Many, many different animals and plants can fill a certain habitat, but only one or two can fulfill a certain niche at the same time. Because of that, we have what's called a realized niche. So when two organisms start to compete with each other for resources, they will actually start to minimize their niche and specialize. So if I put an organism by itself in an environment, it may have multiple roles that it fills. But if I add another organism in that will compete with that one, it will have, the first organism will make its niche much smaller, and that is its realized niche. It does that so that resources are not depleted too quickly. That competition forces specialization, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. Next up, we have the keystone species. A keystone is any organism or species that contributes a huge amount to the biodiversity and has a major impact on the entire ecosystem. So when that organism disappears, or if it's removed, if it goes extinct from an ecosystem, the entire ecosystem changes. And our first example is the sea otter. A sea otter feeds on lots of different shellfish and sea urchins. And that's very important for kelp forests. Kelp is a type of algae that grows in in ocean water, and it's rooted to the ground. Well, it's anchored to the ground, but it doesn't have actual root systems. So sea urchins will come along and destroy those anchors. If an otter is present and the otter is feeding on the urchins, then the urchin population is kept in control, and the sea or the kelp is allowed to grow and be healthy. And that provides areas where small fish can reproduce. It provides areas where small fish can feed, and it increases the amount of biodiversity in an area greatly. If I take the sea otters away, then the sea urchin population explodes, and all of the kelp anchors are destroyed. So the kelp ends up disappearing, and we lose multiple species all in one blow just because we got rid of the sea otter. In North America, the same is true of the gray wolf. Gray wolves used to be fairly common, and because they were hunted, we actually saw an explosion in the herbivore populations, so the deer and the elk and the rabbits and all the things that are eating all those plants, and it literally changed the entire ecosystem. We had plants going extinct, we had all kinds of just, over competition of our herbivores, overpopulation of our herbivores, so the United States has started reintroducing the gray wolf to stabilize that population. Keystone species are often difficult to identify until they are gone. That's one of the hard things about them. Sometimes we don't know the full effect of an organism's extinction until it's too late. And speaking of extinction, this is our last thing. There are different types of extinction. We have the first type called ecological extinction, and that would be like our sea otters. In some places, there are so few sea otters that they really can't do their ecological niche anymore. Even though they still exist in the population or in the ecosystem, there aren't enough of them to do their niche to its full capacity. So they're ecologically extinct. We also have economic and commercial extinction. A big example of this is overfishing. There are some populations of fish that we can't find anymore, or even if we can find them, it's not economically viable anymore for us to go hunting for that fish. And humans throughout history have changed our eating habits based on what was economically available for us. And finally, we have biological extinction. This is the actual final extinction. And I have a picture here of a dodo bird, which was hunted to extinction during the colonial period. And these guys, there are no more. We'll never have them again. They don't exist anywhere else on Earth. That is what most people think of when they think of extinction. Before we have extinction, we have endangerment. This is a Bengal tiger, which is an endangered species. Endangered species are federally protected in the United States and many places around the world. We're going to talk about the Endangered Species Act as part of class, but to be endangered means that this organism could potentially go extinct. And to be ready for tomorrow, if you would please start thinking about a particular biome or aquatic life zone that you're more interested in and would like to do a little bit of research in. That's where we're going to pick up.